Well, hi there. It's Dr. Pete again, Old Man Muscle. And today we're going to talk about something called DNA training. And I've got a slideshow all put together for you on it. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's go. Now, just so you know, I first encountered this topic when I came across a DNA-based fitness certification offered through the International Sports Sciences Association. And as someone who has worked as a trainer and is certified by ISSA and spent much of my professional life in the sciences as a professor, I am naturally curious about new developments in biology and physiology and exercise. But I'm also cautious. Science advances through careful examination, not enthusiasm alone. So when I encountered this certification program, I approached it not as a believer or as a skeptic, but as someone interested in understanding what the evidence really shows. And that curiosity is what led me to make this presentation. So the central question I think that we need to ask is actually quite a simple one, and it's this. Can your DNA really determine the best way for you to exercise, eat, recover, and stay motivated, especially as you get older? So this question sits at the intersection of genetics, physiology, and behavior. And the answer is not as simple as marketing materials sometimes suggest it is. So my goal today is not to promote genetic testing or to dismiss it. Instead, I want to examine the idea carefully and translate the science into language that makes sense to the average person. So this video is to help me and you think critically about what DNA training can mean for us. Is it safe? Is it effective? Does it give us a personalized approach to exercise that we've been looking for? Is there a genuine reason for excitement here? If so, I'll share that. And if there are limitations or unanswered questions, we'll look at those too. But as always, my aim is to inform, to clarify, and to help you and me make wise decisions about our health. Now, right off the bat, I can tell you that most DNA-based fitness programs follow a similar process. A person provides a saliva sample, which is then analyzed for small variations in their DNA. And these variations are called genetic markers. Companies then claim they can use those markers to recommend specific training styles or nutrition strategies that are supposedly better suited to that person's unique biology. This concept is sometimes described as precision fitness, and there's also been the notion of precision nutrition. And the idea in fitness is that your exercise plan can be tailored to your genetic profile. Now, the certification programs for coaches tend to teach these trainers, who, by the way, are not geneticists at all, to examine a number of genetic markers, sometimes more than 30, that are associated with various physiological traits. And these markers are often linked to things like how someone might respond to endurance training versus how they might respond to strength training, or how efficiently they metabolize carbohydrates versus fats, or how quickly they recover from exercise, or even how prone they might be to certain injuries. And some programs even suggest that certain genetic markers are related to behavioral traits, such as how easily someone can stay motivated to exercise. So when you first hear this really does sound quite compelling. But, before accepting these claims, we need to pause and ask a crucial question. When we say that a gene influences how someone responds to exercise, what actually does that mean? Does it mean that the gene determines the outcome, or does it simply mean that it might slightly shift the probability of how someone responds under certain specific circumstances? And understanding that difference is essential. I next want to explain the conceptual appeal of DNA-based coaching. And it goes something like this. If genotype influences phenotype, then knowledge of genotype should allow more precise interventions. And genotype refers to a person's actual genetic makeup encoded into their DNA, while phenotype, with a P-H-E-N-O, means the observable expression of those genes in the form of traits or characteristics. Think of hair color, eye color, and so forth. But also, it can include physiological tendencies, such as how someone's muscles respond to training, how efficiently the person metabolizes nutrients, or how quickly they recover from exercise. Well, the idea then becomes, if you know someone's genotype, this might help guide more precise decisions in the gym. So the reasoning behind DNA-based fitness coaching is this: if genes contribute to these physical tendencies, then learning about those genes might help trainers design exercise and nutrition programs that are better tailored to that individual. So the title of the slide tells us the big picture here, that we're trying to get a handle on being able to personalize a training program based on someone's genetics. Now there's a middle bullet there called SNP-based profiling, and I do need to talk about what SNPs are, or they're called SNPs, next. And before we get into a detailed discussion regarding SNPs, we have a graphic or a picture image here that shows DNA molecules and the actual alphabet that is associated with DNA in terms of these base letters, T, A, G, and C. And what we should focus on is in that blue vertical rectangle. The top DNA sequence shows an A in the lettering, whereas the bottom one shows a G. All the other individual letters were identical to the upper and lower DNA strands, but the A and the G turn out to be different, and those one-letter differences are what we're going to understand as SNPs. And these, in fact, are the genetic markers that are being searched for through the DNA testing that is associated with the DNA training that we're speaking of. So we'll dig into it a bit more on the next slide. So let's see what we can do here to answer the question, what are SNPs? And you see that they are single nucleotide polymorphisms. What on earth? Well, let's start this way, talking about commercial systems analyzing these selected SNPs and translating them into categories such as power versus endurance, macronutrient sensitivity, or behavioral tendencies. So the promise here is individualized programming beyond population averages. And when companies that do DNA testing talk about genetic markers in DNA-based fitness testing here, what they are usually referring to are small variations in the DNA that are called SNPs, which we said stands for single nucleotide polymorphisms. Now, to understand what that means, it helps to remember the image that we just looked at on the previous slide, but here we say that the DNA is essentially a very long sequence of chemical letters, and we saw those letters, A, T, C, and G, and these form the instructions that make up our genetic code. And most of that sequence is identical from person to person. In fact, human DNA is more than 99.9% the same across the human population. But in certain locations along the DNA strand, one letter can differ between individuals. And a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, SNP, is simply one of those locations where we have a single letter that's different. For example, one person might have an A at a particular position in their DNA sequence, while another person might have a G at that same position. And that tiny difference is what scientists call a genetic variant. And when DNA testing companies analyze saliva samples, they are not sequencing the entire human genome from the saliva sample. Instead, they are typically looking at a selected subset. They're looking at these SNP locations, sometimes just a few dozen, that previous studies have suggested might be associated with certain traits. So this is the key here. So when a fitness program talks about genetic markers related to training response, they are almost always referring to specific SNPs that have been linked in research studies to things like endurance capacity or muscle fiber characteristics or inflammation response or metabolism. However, it's important to understand what these SNPs can and cannot tell us. Most SNPs do not determine a trait by themselves. Instead, they may slightly shift the probability of how someone responds in a particular biological pathway. And because most fitness-related traits, like strength or endurance or fat loss, are influenced not by one but by many genes interacting together, a single SNP usually explains only a very small part of the overall picture. So in other words, SNPs are useful as clues, but they are rarely decisive instructions. They're just too limited in the information they provide. This is why most scientists emphasize that while SNP research is interesting and potentially informative, it is still limited in its ability to predict exactly how a particular person will respond to training. And for practical purposes, the adaptations that matter the most, meaning gaining strength, improving your cardiovascular system, improving your metabolic health, these all remain strongly influenced by the training stimulus itself, along with adequate sleep, proper nutrition, adequate recovery, and consistency in your training. If I was teaching a class of students about this topic, this is probably what I would tell them. First, the science behind genetic variation is real. Small DNA variations, which we've been identifying as SNPs, can influence how certain biological systems function. Some studies have found that certain SNPs are associated with small differences in how individuals respond to exercise training, including changes in aerobic fitness or other physiological traits. However, this is where the nuance becomes important. Although researchers have identified many genes and SNPs that might be associated with training responses, very few of these genetic variants have been consistently replicated across multiple studies, and the effects of individual SNPs are usually minimal. In fact, systematic reviews have identified dozens of possible candidate genes involved in exercise adaptation, yet only a small number have been confirmed by more than one research group. This means that while genetics contributes to variability in how people respond to training, our ability to predict individual outcomes from a small set of SNPs is still limited. Another point I'd make is that exercise traits are not controlled by single genes. Strength, endurance, fat loss, and remember, are polygenic traits, meaning they are influenced by many genes interacting with lifestyle factors such as training intensity, nutrition, sleep, stress, and the person's overall health. And perhaps most importantly, physiological traits related to fitness remain highly adaptable. Even measures such as VO2 max, which have genetic influences, can still increase substantially merely through regular training. So, I think the bottom line is that genetics can influence how people respond to exercise, but it does not determine whether someone can improve, and it does not replace the fundamentals of training. For most people, especially those exercising for health, longevity, and quality of life, the factors that matter most remain remarkably consistent, and they are appropriate training stimulus, progressive overload, adequate protein and nutrition, sufficient recovery and sleep, and long-term consistency in training. So DNA testing may eventually become a useful supplementary tool as the science advances, but based on current evidence, it should be viewed as an interesting source of additional information rather than a definitive guide to exercise prescription. In other words, SNP research tells us something meaningful about human biology, but it does not yet provide a shortcut to designing the perfect training program. For now, the most reliable approach remains the same one exercise science has supported for decades: well-structured training adjusted over time based on real-world observable results. So let me just say a little bit about the current state of evidence as obtained through scientific research. First, some genetic variants have been associated with endurance performance. For example, power versus endurance tendencies in the person. And some studies suggest certain individuals may respond slightly better to specific training styles. However, the effect sizes are generally small, so these studies do not include a large number of individuals, which limits the translational impact. And research in elite athletes does not always translate cleanly to the general population, especially in older adults. And then long-term randomized trials showing that DNA match programs dramatically outperform well-designed standard programs are really lacking. So the science is intriguing, but it's still developing. We are not yet at a point where a cheek swab can design the perfect fitness program. So, when we look at the peer-reviewed science, we do see some genetic influence on how bodies respond to exercise, for example, in VO2 max changes or in blood pressure response. But the overall picture is complex and modest at best. In fact, only a few genetic variants have been reliably linked to real-world training responses in multiple studies. And exercise itself can alter gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms, showing that lifestyle interacts with genes, not simply obeys them. What if I told you that scientists have identified a gene that appears frequently in Olympic sprinters, and that a simple DNA test could tell you whether you have it? That gene is called ACTN3, and it has been widely promoted as the, quote, speed gene. Could a single gene determine whether you are meant to be a power sprinter and not an endurance marathon runner? That question has been widely discussed, but as we'll see, the story behind that label is far more nuanced than the headlines suggest. Now let's together look at a specific example of a particular gene study and explain why it doesn't mean what marketing might imply. So one of the most commonly cited genes in exercise genetics research is the ACTN3 gene, sometimes nicknamed the speed gene. And it's a well-known study by Yang et al., published in 2003 in the American Journal of Human Genetics, and it found that a particular variant of this particular ACTN3 gene was more common in elite sprint and power athletes, while another variant was more common in endurance athletes. So, on the surface, that sounds pretty compelling, right? The marketing folks translated that scientific information as follows: test your ACTN3 gene and we'll tell you whether you're built for power or endurance. But here's what the study actually showed, and just as importantly, did not show. The researchers found an association in elite athletes. They did not show that the gene determines whether someone will succeed at sprinting or endurance. or that people with the endurance version don't have the ability to build power, or that people with the power version don't have the ability to improve their aerobic fitness, and did not show that a training program matched to this gene produces superior long-term outcomes. In fact, millions of non-elite athletes with every ACTN3 variant will improve dramatically with both resistance and endurance training. So what does the gene really tell us? I think it suggests that at the highest levels of international sport and athletics, where very small biological differences do matter, genetics may slightly influence muscle fiber characteristics. But for the general population, and especially for the aging population, training consistency, progressive overload, nutrition and recovery, all the things I've been talking about, overwhelm the influence of this single gene. And we could say it this way: a gene associated with Olympic sprinters does not dictate how your body will respond to a well-designed strength program at age 65. And that distinction can be lost in marketing language. So, my friends, let me give you my bottom line in all of this. We don't need to modify our DNA to improve our physiology. We just need to stimulate it correctly. And cellular signaling is something that we can control. At this point in the presentation, I'd like to mention the AMPK-mTOR method of training. Exercise changes signaling, not genetic code. The AMPK-mTOR method is about activating what's already built into us. Respectfully, when we train as older adults using the AMPK-mTOR method, we're not editing DNA during our training. DNA is static. However, cellular signaling is dynamic. AMPK and mTOR are not DNA molecules. They are signaling proteins that belong to a family of kinase enzymes. Exercise doesn't somehow rewrite them. It regulates how powerfully they're expressed. The real leverage isn't in chasing your genetic code. It's in consistently applying the right stimulus in order to optimize biological signaling for health and fitness, living longer and living stronger. That's the concept behind strongevity. Cellular signaling responds far more reliably to load, energy balance, and protein intake than to a genetic report. That's where I place my emphasis, and I suggest that for all older adults interested in what I call strongevity, strength times longevity, is to emphasize the same. And as we age, the issue isn't changing our DNA, it's preserving function. AMPK and mTOR are proteins involved with longevity and with muscle building. It's the perfect match. What proper training can therefore do is regulate how effectively those pathways are activated. Strategic conditioning with the proper aerobic exercise and calorie deficit is what stimulates AMPK to support metabolic health and mitochondrial function. On the other hand, progressive resistance training with abundant protein intake activates mTOR to preserve muscle and strength. So when properly balanced with recovery on alternating days, these signaling patterns help protect against sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting, metabolic decline, and loss of resilience as we age. So in a real sense, we're not modifying the blueprint, we're keeping it operational. Now, I've put together a diagram that I'd like to go over with you right now, and it contrasts two different approaches to exercise personalization. The first is DNA-based training using SNP panels. This begins by examining genetic markers and identifying statistical associations between those markers and traits such as endurance capacity, power potential, or nutrient metabolism. And from those associations, Categorical recommendations may be made, for example, emphasizing endurance training, strength training, or particular dietary strategies. However, these recommendations are based on population-level probabilities and therefore have limited predictive power for any single individual, making them relatively static starting points. Now, by contrast, signal-based programming using the AMPK-mTOR method focuses on physiological signals that are known to drive adaptation. Training is structured to deliberately stimulate metabolic repair pathways via AMPK and muscle-building pathways via mTOR, while aligning nutrition and recovery to support those signals. Progression is then adjusted based on the observed response of the individual, making the process dynamic, adaptive, and individualized in real time rather than inferred from genetic tendencies alone. Rather than trying to predict our biology from a cheek swab, we can directly stimulate the biological pathways that drive adaptation. When we intelligently activate both metabolic and muscle-building signals, what I describe as the AMPK and mTOR method and pathways, we are working with physiology that we can influence every day. Okay, I see it has been a long presentation, hasn't it? I hope you forgive me for that. But for you, perhaps it has been interesting and informative. And while genetic testing may offer interesting insights for us, the real power at present remains in the choices we make each day. So keep training, practice good nutrition, and get good rest and sleep. Movement, resistance, nourishment, recovery, and persistence are things that activate the biology of adaptation. And they are the tools through which we shape our health, preserve our independence, and improve our quality of life as we age. So that's it, DNA training. What did you think? Well, that's the end, and this is Dr. Pete saying that I'll see you next time, and I do try to keep track and up to date on new topics in fitness. There's always something new around the corner, so I'll keep you updated and I'll keep myself informed. And until then, take care. I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.